health and care coming together as part of an integrated service with the families at the centre. And I think there's, with checks and balances in place around accountability so that the plans are of a high quality, that all providers understand the link between those parents' aspirations, the child's need, the provision, the outcomes that are needing to be achieved through the plan, and the provision that meets those outcomes. And that golden thread across aspirations, need, outcomes and provision, to have a shared understanding of that across education, health and care is sometimes, when it was a very siloed approach, people spoke different languages, and coming together with one process, with the families at the centre, is the way forward. So it's working well in some areas, but it's quite patchy in others. And the recent inspection outcomes from the first SEND inspections, the first 30 SEND inspections from May 16 to May 17, are saying that the areas that are doing the education, health and care planning the best are those areas that have set up a truly integrated service that is accountable across education, health and care, with everyone speaking the same language.
Okay, so looking at it the other end, what did you see? What had broken down when they hadn't set up the processes? So who was missing? Who wasn't doing?
So sometimes health partners, and in terms of the reports as part of the process, sometimes the health there was some delays in the reports coming in a timely way to meet the 20-week deadline. In some authorities, the parents weren't truly involved as part of the whole process, with their thoughts and aspirations right at the centre. And in some authorities, the voice of the child and young person wasn't really clearly evidence-based as part of the plan, and really struggling to see how the child and young person's voice was part of it.
When we visited Swiss Cottage School, we met there with parents and carers group, and there was a good few in the room, and the majority of them said they still have to present the case of their child at every visit, at every hospital appointment, to every therapist that they meet. That was some weeks back. So now they were linked to a centre of excellence, and they still felt that the service was outside of them.
I think we hear that a lot from our parents and our parent carer forums, and looking at the Ofsted local area SEND inspections 1 year on, it said the statutory assessment process was not working well enough in just over 2/3 of the local areas inspected. So after the first 30, it was 21. In particular, the common weaknesses in the process of securing the statutory contributions from health and care professionals to assessments. Consequently, the quality of the plans varied considerably, both within the local authority and across the local area inspected.
So that's not very good, is it? Yeah. So what did they say? That wasn't very good.
They were saying that was what was the findings. We're across London. We're, as part of the regional lead programme, we're doing quite a lot of peer moderation with other boroughs to learn from the best, so that we're together. We're not working in silos across the 33 London boroughs, but actually looking at learning from the authorities that have had really good processes, really good outcomes, and being able to peer moderate with each other so that we're sharing best practice and disseminating best practice, and doing that very much in partnership with our parent carer forums as well.
Okay, thank you. Gill, what can you add to this first question?
I represent the teaching schools across the whole country, and I'm the first vice chair to be a special school head teacher. I've been a special school head teacher for 24 years. And I think this is one of the main areas of discussion when teaching schools do meet, is that the rigour of the education healthcare plan isn't there. The promises that were made have not been met, and parents as a whole seem to be more disadvantaged with the setup now than they were when it was a statement. I think we were given too many promises about what was going to happen. Too much money was spent on training, and the outcome, I feel, from what head teachers tell me, is nothing compared to what we were promised. So I think it's still a battle. Teachers and head teachers refer to them as education plans. The health and the care doesn't seem to be there in many cases. Where it is, it's usually of a very high standard. But in the majority of concerns that head teachers have, the only representation at those meetings are the parents and education. And whether or not that is because the meetings are usually held in schools, so in the case we attract audience, I don't know whether that is the case or not, but parents on the whole, from what the information I've received, I just feel that they've had a very rough deal from the promises that were made.
Right. And do you have examples of good practice? Because as a head teacher in this area, you would have been striving all those years for good practice.
Yes, it tends to be small rural communities that have more of a collegiate approach. So the representatives from health know the children very well. There may be only one person working with that school. And I think in some of the larger boroughs, larger local authorities, that's where sometimes it falls by the wayside. Therefore, the parents do have to repeat every time the information about their child. So I could easily collate statistics for that for you to present, because it is a hot topic amongst head teachers.
We'd welcome that. Again, I think we're going to have to maybe hear more from health colleagues. Okay, Alison, what about your commissioning role here?
So I'm not a commissioner. So my role, the designated clinical officer or medical officer role, is a role that was established as part of the code of practice from the SEND reforms to support clinical commissioning groups to implement the reforms. So I technically sit as part of the quality function in the CCG, but work very closely with my commissioning colleagues. I think health, as Helen said, along with social care, were quite rightly criticised for lack of engagement initially in the implementation of the reforms at all levels. And people commonly say we were slow to come to the party. I think sometimes we weren't invited to the party, but particularly around development of education, health and care plans. I think one of the good bits of news is that in the standard NHS contract this year, there is a requirement for health trusts and health providers to participate in the process and to provide their evidence within 6 weeks. So we do have some key performance indicators and measures of that sort of now, and a clear expectation. I think one of the challenges is making sure that we ask the right health professionals to provide advice. So when children went through the old statementing process, therapies were very engaged in that and used to providing advice, as were medical colleagues. But actually now we're expecting a much greater range of professionals to participate, and people who didn't commonly engage. So our health visiting and school nursing colleagues, specialist nursing and mental health services. So it's been a huge learning curve for colleagues in those services, and some of those services haven't traditionally worked in an outcome-focused way. They're commissioned often on an activity basis, so how many times have they done something to a child, whether or not they've made that child better, worse, or sort of indifferent. So I think our commissioning needs to change to an outcome-focused approach. Locally, along with other colleagues in similar roles, we've done lots of training for health staff. So my colleague in Hounslow and Ealing, we're doing a series of workshops with our mental health trusts at the moment, because they've struggled to understand the full impact of the SEND agenda on their services, that it's not just about children with education, health and care plans, but around all our population of children with SEN and disabilities. They're quite caught up with the confidentiality aspect, particularly in CAMS, so this needing to share and join in and have a truly co-produced, not just with parents but with other colleagues, approach has been quite difficult to overcome. I think outcome focus still needs work. Therapies would often talk about, improving a child's core stability or fine motor skills, but with so what, what does that mean to a child? So thinking about those meaningful outcomes, the golden thread, as Helen has spoken about, that longer term planning. So the area I work in has a significant number of provider trusts that aren't necessarily coterminous with either the local authority or the CCG boundary. Their information systems are all different, they don't talk to each other, so it's quite difficult to get that tell-it-once approach that the Code of Practice asks us to do when people are all using different systems and some services still working on paper. We do have some good examples there around what we would call a hospital passport or a communication passport. So we've worked well with our Parent Carer Forum, particularly in RBKC, and they've worked to produce quite a simple guide that a family can take, whether that's to a hospital, to any new appointment that they go to, that explains their child's difficulties, how it's best to communicate with them. And we've worked with our hospitals, so Chelsea and Westminster will always try and see a child with learning difficulties and who might find waiting very difficult at the beginning of a clinic. They're allowed to have double length appointments. So there are examples of where people are trying to accommodate. I think it's good in parts, it's got better, but there is still a long way to go in terms of having truly co-produced education health care plans with joint outcomes.
You started off by saying you weren't invited to the party. I mean, I would have thought that a child at birth with complex health needs invites itself or invites health to actually anything that's taking place around services that are required.
I think around individual children, I think strategically the early planning didn't necessarily didn't happen with health in the same way it happened in local authority services. So we have examples where health weren't part of a local area's sort of SEND executive board, for example, and that's been a criticism around the absence of that strategic join-up and leadership in many of the inspections. And we know areas where they've done very well and seen as very good practice in inspections are those that have had that true join-up governance at a senior level and capacity from health to deliver those reforms.
Can you say anything about, we noticed that Ofsted and the CQC SEND area reviews of 6 London boroughs have found that the NHS had not appointed a designated medical officer, and that Ofsted concluded that even when a DMO was in place, they were unable to carry out their strategic duties effectively due to other resource pressures. What are the resource pressures, and why with this incredibly important area would there not be an appointment made?
Absolutely. I come from an area where they did invest. The choice was to have a designated medical officer or a clinical officer. So I'm a children's occupational therapist by background, so hence I'm called a clinical officer, not a medical officer. It's a post that the code requires, or strongly recommends that areas have. It's a non-statutory post, so unlike our designated safeguarding and looked after posts, it doesn't have that same statutory presence at the moment. There have been conversations with NHS England around should it be statutory. I think the role has evolved from the code. It was quite a transactional description of the job in terms of ensuring that early notifications could be made to a local authority, being able to support schools with their duties in supporting children with medical conditions and acting as a point of contact. The area where I work saw it as an opportunity to have a more strategic role from the very beginning, and hence my post was full-time. In lots of areas, it has still sat with commonly a paediatrician in one of the hospital or community providers who is doing the post alongside their ordinary clinical duties. So typically somebody might have 1 or 2 sessions, so that's a half day, a week to carry out the role, and in which case you can only do it at a very different sort of depth to somebody who does it as a full-time sort of post.
And that would identify the resource pressures.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me just go on to question 2, and it follows on, and it's to Yolande. You've heard about the local offers being so variable, which for parents and children not getting that service is a disgrace, really. What role does London councils play in sort of drawing to the attention of their, because you're a membership body of the 32, and so is it okay if only 6 of you are doing well in this area, and then you say, oh, sad, the others can't make it? Or what can you do, and what do you do when you see your fellow boroughs not doing anything?
Helen mentioned that Bromley works with Enfield and the Department for Education and also a couple of other organisations to bring some regional cohesion in terms of sharing good practice, and London Councils is also part of that group. And one of the areas we've actually focused quite a lot of attention on is the local offer, because it is variable and there's no 2 ways about that. I think the context of local offers, and it's something that we've discussed at length with the Department for Education, is when the concept of a local offer was introduced, a lot of people spent an awful lot of energy in looking at very highly specialist services. So what specialist services do we have available for young people and children with very complex needs? And then they started to look at targeted services, and I think not enough energy and effort was put into what I term as universal services. And in effect, what we need to do now is reverse that triangle. I use the term services in an extremely broad way here. So obviously there are services that local government needs to commission, there are services that clinical commissioning groups need to commission. But we also need to bear in mind that within a universal service are our mainstream schools doing what they need to do for young people with SEN. Also, particularly when we're talking about young people with particular social learning disabilities, if a child and their family isn't welcomed into their local shopping centre because the child's behaviour is different, you start to isolate a family. If the leisure provision in an area is even perceived as unwelcoming for your child...
Yes, but we know that, Yolande.
Yeah.
You've identified there are places where that is the case.
Yeah.
What can you do about it?
So I was just about to lead into a really good example of where actually a London Borough, working with their Parent Carer Forum, actually did make a big difference, was in Wandsworth. So the Parent Carer Forum, working with borough officers, actually parents went to visit leisure centres. So they talked, for example, to the local swimming centre, where many of their parents, for their children, swimming was also part of their occupational therapy. So they made arrangements to have different timed sessions for children who found it difficult to be in the swimming pool, and there was lots of children. So the parents arranged that. And also the parents didn't arrange it just so they could get the services free. What they said is, we're happy to pay, but we just need you to time it differently for us. Right through to walking into all of the retail centres, talking to the small museums in the area, fully with the support and backing of the borough. I think that's a really good example of also genuine co-production as well. It's not just about thinking about services just purely as a commissioner, it's genuinely sitting down with parents and saying, talk to us in the round about what you feel you and your child can't access, and then working with parents, working with the families to change just the whole process of commissioning. Now that's obviously a brilliant example, and we need to get more people to do that. So one of the things that Helen and I do is make sure that we present examples like Wandsworth to our other boroughs, make sure they have access to those borough officers so they can start to bring that kind of practice into their boroughs as well.
Okay, Fiona?
I'm quite interested in the sort of co-production model, and sort of I think it sounds like a really positive example. But how is satisfaction by parents measured in this area? Because it also sounds quite time intensive for the parents concerned, in a way that is probably necessary when you're starting to change attitudes. But I just wondered how parent satisfaction with the services would be measured.
That's a really good question. We're fortunate we get to speak to parents quite regularly, and obviously it's important that they're honest with us. So there's a big difference between genuine co-production and simply consulting with parents. We have different models with our parent carer forums in boroughs. So for example, the lead parent carer forum officer for Bromley is actually a paid member of staff, because it acknowledges the fact that we're asking parents to contribute. As a professional, they understand their children's needs and they're part of that professional team. I think where it's helpful to have close working links with parent carer forums, and where it's important that they're honest, they are honest with us, is they can show us areas where they feel that we need to do better. I mean, certainly it's important to talk to parents, but we are also talking about not just children, we're talking about young people here as well. It's very important that we co-produce with young people, and we do acknowledge that we struggle with that a little bit. Because engaging young people, that you do very differently, but we're also talking about engaging with young people who may not be verbal, who communicate in very different ways, and we work very closely with our parent carer forums to help us do that better. So I think in terms of satisfaction, some of the things that our boroughs do, and I'm simply because I work closely with Bromley, I'm going to reference Bromley here, is that it's not just about surveying parent carer forums, talking to parent carer forums on a regular basis about, right, together what we will do is we will look at what do you feel we're doing better, what do we need to do better, and what better things do we need to do. Is that common practice? Probably not common enough, but I think that's a good example of how you work with a parent carer forum, to not simply go, are you satisfied with this service? It's genuinely always about making it better.
How many boroughs do you think would do that? Because I think the idea of improvement is quite an important one,
yes,
and sort of looking at that. But how many boroughs do you think actively take that approach?
All of them strive to, because I talk to most of our boroughs and they do genuinely strive to. I think some are just further ahead than others, and I think even Helen in Bromley would acknowledge that one of the reasons that Bromley is further ahead is they were one of the early pilot boroughs. Before the legislation was introduced, they had kind of a 2-year lead in. So we are looking to those boroughs that were slightly ahead of the legislation to say, you are ahead of the legislation, let's pick up as much good practice from you as possible and support our other boroughs to bring that practice in.
Helen, do come in.
There's also a twice yearly national survey from parent carer forums that are encouraged to do together with local authorities, and that gives very rich from across the country, very rich advice about where parents feeling their voices heard in shaping services. And I'm covering part-time an interim headship of a special school in the London Borough of Croydon at the moment, and we had our Ofsted inspection last month, and I was very heartened that the inspectors in their questioning were asking wider wider questions about how parents were supported beyond that narrow education in terms of short breaks, access to the community, the local offer in its widest sense. Were parents feeling fully supported in enabling their child to be accessed to local facilities? And there's very, very good questioning from the Ofsted inspectors that in inspections a few years ago, it would have just been questions around the education component of the child in the school Ofsted inspections. So I'm feeling that that co-production is being modelled in London. We had a London Strategic Managers Network that had representatives from senior education, health and social care. We meet 3 monthly. Now we have the parent carer forums, very much each of the 3 parent carer forums across London, sending 3 representatives to each meeting. And to begin with, some of the managers were saying, do we need a forum that's without parents so we can discuss things? When parents came along and realised the richness that they brought to the debate, now we're saying we're not going to move forward without those parent carer forums and those parents' voice being part of every single meeting. And our London regional parent representatives from the parent carer forums speak at every single strategic managers meeting, don't they?
Before I bring Susan in, Gill, from what you've just heard, do you get this feeding in to the day-to-day experience?
No.
Because it's not what we've heard.
I think this is something quite different from the majority of parent carer forums. Excuse me. And I think we still, in the schools that I work directly with, we still suffer in a sense from the parents who can't engage, who are tired, who can't fight their own battle, who haven't got the resources to do these things. And it always seems to be the parents who've got the voice, who've got the ability, who've got access to transport, who've got supportive partners, who I'm generalising and it will be different, but I think it's that small group of parents who sometimes have the most difficult children, particularly children with profound and multiple learning difficulties, and especially if they're in the Asian Pakistani community, who haven't got that ability to do it but still need. So the child becomes totally isolated. The money that's given for social care is usually spent on relatives to look after the child in the home, so that child is getting no access to the outside world other than school. So I think it is happening really well, where you've got a very strong, outspoken parent who can gather representation, but there's a lot of parents who need it, who just cannot access it. And I think it's focusing on that group and how we do that.
We also heard about the gap that is created by school holidays, so that the parents spend all of that time walking parks, and parks that have got facilities for children but couldn't accommodate children and young people with SEND. And also you talked about swimming. We heard some awful stories about swimming where the pool was there, the time slot was there, the equipment was there, but there was no staff to help the mother with 2 children, perhaps all 3. So the child with SEND needs had to stay in the pram, or pushchair, couldn't get in the pool. So we heard some really.
I think a lot of the parents that I talk to don't want to be a group of people with similar needs. They want to be with other able, communicative children, so that if there is a chance of their child picking up language, they will do, rather than with children who have no verbal communication. So a lot of my parents avoid groups of the same. A lot of parents don't come to my parents' groups because they don't want to hear things that might happen to their child later on in life. So it's really difficult getting the balance. And as I say, how we go about that, I'm not quite sure, because the resources aren't out there.
Okay, Susan, thank you.
Really quick, because I know we're running. Helen, you said earlier that you think working in proper integrated services with all the agencies going to the table, it works, and I absolutely agree with that. I've done lots of it. But always, when I've done things within my own council, the one group that don't come to the table is health. They won't give the information out, etc. Now, Alison, you mentioned that you had problems with CAMS because of specific confidentiality aspects. Do CAMS have something far more stringent than other parts of services, or are they hiding in effect behind we can't do this because I've just come across it for the last 10 years?
I think we're all bound by information governance arrangements. I think it's around understanding. They often hold information about the family and will include that in some of their reports, which isn't necessarily appropriate to be shared as part of an education, health and care plan or contribution, but it's about working with them to ensure that they do share the information that's appropriate to the child. So we've done lots of work explaining to them that parents have consented to this process, that consent is there for information to be shared, and that they should, as a matter of good practice, discuss their contribution to the needs assessment process with the family.
And are they listening to you?
Yes. I think it's been a cultural shift, and they aren't professionals who routinely contributed to the statementing process. So this is a journey for them, and they've taken more time than other professionals have to sort of move forward.
Yes, which of course causes problems. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. David.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask a little bit about planning that is made for SEND, and particularly for special schools. As we know, London's population, school-age population, is rapidly growing, and figures I have is that we'll need another 1,900 more places in special schools over the next 10 years. So if I could start with Yolande, how do local authorities project demand and plan for new special schools?
We've been doing school projection work for a long time. We're fortunate we work with our GLA colleagues on that as well. So I think we're getting a bit better at that. It's always, as you well know, particularly in any predictions, there's a little bit of art and science going on with those. I think with special schools, whilst we look at the population of young people who are currently in a special school, we also have to consider young people with particularly complex needs. But I would like to just draw a little note there. We genuinely do also want to operate on the presumption of inclusion. Actually picking up Gill's point, many parents, with their child as SEN or not, they want them to go to mainstream schools. So we have to think about special school places in the context of where that would be appropriate to ensure that parents have choice, etc. But our starting point would be to look at young people who are better supported in special school. Are we seeing more young people coming through the school system who might need a special school place? Now that we've got a 0 to 25 system, it is genuinely different to the old statement system. So I think we need to consider quite new data to help us do that planning. So, for example, how are we using National Health Service paediatric data, for example, for babies who are born prematurely? And sadly, very frequently have extremely complex needs. Also, we can now start to look at children 2 and 3 year olds who have childcare entitlements, and are they already presenting with special educational needs? So we can start to look at, will these young people, will these children, when they enter school age, will their needs mean that they need more support? But that's not just thinking about special school places, that's also about, and actually after the session I'd be quite keen to talk to Gill, are we genuinely supporting our teachers in mainstream to be able to work with and support children with slightly more complex needs in the mainstream, so it's not just about special school places? But so we think in the round, special school places, yes, looking at the need coming through the system, but also what more do we need to do to ensure that our mainstream school settings are better equipped to support our children with SEN.
I agree with you. As an ex-teacher, I know it's often very difficult for teachers to know what to do, and they need a lot of support in being able to give the best to special needs children. Could I bring in Joanne and Gill as well? Have you got anything to say on that, the planning that local authorities do, and also what the mayor could do, what the mayor does to help planning for new special schools? Joanne.
If I can go, I mean, just to agree with Yolande that we've worked very closely, and you will have seen in your briefings that London Council has produced a report earlier this year about, do the maths report about school places in general, but also that had a section on the increasing need for SEND places both in mainstream schools and special schools. But one finding of that report, I'm going to quote it here if I can, was that the majority of London local authorities stated that their projection methodology of SEND places lacked the sophistication and rigour of the approaches taken in projecting mainstream places. Only a few local authorities were able to quantify additional place need. And as a result of that recommendation, what the Mayor has done is that the intelligence unit here is now going to develop pan-London projections for SEND places. That should be published by the end of this year, but please accept it might go into the new year. And in part because in developing the new London plan about the need for future school places, that was highlighted as an issue. And so that work has started and those projections should come out shortly. But those projections at the moment will be on London-wide data. We're having further conversations. This was discussed at the joint meeting with London councils this month about whether we can break down that information further and look at borough projections, and in particular about cross-borough projections, and see what we can do to actually improve that data so that there can be better planning. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think there are two issues going forward at the moment which have been promoted by the Secretary of State, and I'm doing work with the DFE, being commissioned to work on behalf of the Teaching School Council to support better mainstream schools. One of them is the Rochford Reviews, which the recommendations are out now. We have chosen the 8 regional hubs across the country, of which the Bridge School in Islington is one. So they will be providing training not only for in assessment and data collection, not only for special schools but for mainstream schools. And within that there will also be a package of support around CPD, which was another recommendation of the Rochford Review. On top of that, there's a review going forward regarding ITT, and we're trying to put forward a possibility of, instead of teachers, newly qualified teachers or pre-newly qualified teachers training just in primary and perhaps having a small period of time in special, they are going to be doing, we hope, primary with SND. There is a primary with PE at the moment, but I'm pushing through to the Secretary of State that we should have a primary and SND, which we don't want the two training paths to go separate. We don't want just a special and we don't want just a mainstream, because that's what we got rid of years and years ago. We want that amalgamation. So those are quite a few very high-profiled pieces of work that the DFE are funding, and the launch of this is on the 4th of December at Sanctuary Buildings. Along with that is the Secretary of State is investing more time and more funding in pupil premium, and we have now got brokerage coordinators in place because the Secretary of State was not happy with the quality of the pupil premium reviews that were taking place in schools. There was too much variation. So I was commissioned to identify brokerage coordinators who will match the school up with a qualified reviewer to carry out the reviewer, because in some cases some schools were just getting, not being disrespectful, but getting friends and colleagues to carry out the reviews, and it needs to be carried out by someone who's had that recognised training. So two very, very prominent issues which I hope will support mainstream schools better to provide that necessary support for SEND pupils.
Yes, Helen.
Yeah, we also every authority in the country at the beginning of this year had quite a considerable allocation, about £100,000, 23 million in all, for the High Needs Strategic Planning Fund, and looking at the planning of recognising there's an increase in numbers of children and young people with SEND, to be able to strategically plan provision, and looking at perhaps collaboration with other local authorities in planning the new provision and what's needed in each area. And we had, in Bromley, we had a number of focus groups. One of them was a specialist specialist provision focus group, really looking at what the needs were. And then each authority has also now got a specialist provision funding allocation to be able to begin to implement those plans, so that we're looking at filling the gaps in local provision, and as a community having the right places for the right children in the right provision locally, rather than children needing to go out of borough places that are often very much more expensive, away from their families and their communities. Also in South London, we've got a South London SEN commissioning forum, looking at, for those children that do need to go out of borough into our independent and non-maintained sector, being able to look at planning for that together and monitoring and accountability for that across 9 of the South London boroughs, coming together in collaboration around that.
Claire is going to come round and ask you whether you want coffee or tea, because I'm just mindful that your feet, you might be getting a bit of a draft, and it might be you might be starting to get cold, and I do apologise for that. So you'll be getting a hot drink in a minute. I think we're going to have to ask for blankets. But I do apologise for that. Just to finish this section, Alison, you heard Joanne and Yolande talked about some joint working. Were you aware of that? And if you weren't, isn't that now an opportunity for health to be positively engaged with the GLA and London councils?
So I know Elaine Ruddy, who is the NHS England lead for SEND,
Right.
has been having conversations with Yolande around actually having a London-wide SEND network, and I think it's the time to do that, sort of now. Forums that Helen has spoken about, London Strategic Managers, and the SEND champion with Bromley and Enfield, have been fantastic opportunities. And I think, the longer we can continue those, so that we're not all reinventing the wheel. I've been privileged to be part of those. Health are underrepresented in terms of availability of places on those, but I think it's a really good opportunity for us to do that joined up working.
And come back to Joanne with your deputy mayor's role and the London-wide. Isn't that something that really you could help facilitate, this London-wide SEND network? I only say that because from everything I've heard in my own experience, when local authority invites health, there's resistance. When health invites local authority, there's resistance, and education. And it just seems, and also, Joanne, you'll recall, when we held a frontline practitioners course here, everybody came because it was at City Hall. So I'm just wondering, in terms of being the broker.
To support. I mean, I think Yolande could probably say about what stage that discussion is at, but we'll happily return.
Do you see what I mean? It just seems from experience.
We could certainly offer a venue,
Yeah, they come together at a neutral place rather than to each other's place, which I suppose maybe it's a bit of professionalism.
I would also add, I think in fairness to my NHS colleagues, I don't think I would characterise it as resistance either way. I think genuinely, health is a big organism, local government is a big organism, and a lot of the issues that we've had is getting the right people around the table. It's really helpful that Alison mentions that I'm in communication with Elaine Ruddy, but also it's finding also the right hooks that meet everybody's needs. So the piece of work that Joanne mentioned around us doing that more granular work around the data for planning, that's a perfect way for us to then look at who we want on the steering group. No. So that's about having NHS people around the table, making sure that's at a very strategic level, people are always locked in, so that then from the strategic level it always travels down, so you can see that up and down. So every time an education, health and care plan is done, it's easier then to get to the professionals that you need to contribute to that education, health and care plan, and you get that virtuous circle of right from strategic planning, but all the way right down to the individual child or young person and their plan.
I totally accept that. I won't retract from what I've said, because that's from experience that we've seen that. And we, as Assembly members, are driven by what we're hearing from the citizen. You as professionals can be as nice as you like with each other. And we're nice with you as well, but I'm just saying that from the experience we've picked up, it would seem to find a neutral place of somebody coordinating that, brings together that cross-section of professionals, and in this area it seems that that's so needed at the moment. So thanks, Joanne.
Can I say, Chair, obviously we can venue, but I think the process needs to be driven by those that have got the duty to deliver it.
It's about how you coordinate and bring that together. Yeah. Coordinating doesn't mean you take it over.
Thank you.
this is actually a really good example of where organisations that have statutory responsibility working with an organisation that doesn't, and actually how you can make that work.
And offer perhaps some leadership and convening powers, yes.
That's lovely. Susan, has everybody got some tea now and is warming up? Yeah, I'd like a black tea. Everybody's got tea except me. Black tea, thank you. It's pathetic. A state-of-the-art building that's won prizes, and I can tell you why it's told here, but I won't go into detail because it's like a nonsense. Susan?
Discussion in terms of health. Can I just add a comment in terms of the discussion around small places and planning of schools? Because I think often there's a danger that that's done in isolation, and we have examples of where new provisions or new schools are built without that joint planning with health, and yet then there's an expectation that we magic up a speech and language therapist, an occupational therapist, community nursing. So I think again it's that looking at it from the strategic joined up approach and not purely from a local authority sort of perspective, because we start off then with a lovely building but without necessarily the right team around the child.
Of course.
So with that. And I think one of the other elements of the code was reinforcing health's duty around early notification to local authorities. So that's something we're doing a lot of work on in our areas. So it's not just a paediatrician who does it, which was tended to what happened under the 96 legislation. So that there is early work, and that might be a health visitor notifying the local authority, a speech and language therapist, so that you have very early on that picture of who your children and young people are coming through, and that they don't just turn up on a school's doorstep sort of at the age of 4 or 5. So I think that's a really important and useful part of the code to support planning.
Thank you for that. Susan, if you take us to the next question.
If I can just quickly say, you're completely right, absolutely right. Those of us that have been around for a while, I think, throw our hands in the air, because in past times, health just does not come to the table, and I think, therefore, this could be the problem. So we really need to wipe the slate and start thinking differently. Changing the subject slightly, Yolande and Helen probably would be best for this. Why do you think there are more tribunal appeals in London than most other parts of the country? And there are also significant differences in a number of cases that reach tribunal in different boroughs. So do you know why this would be?
Well, we do have a significantly larger proportion of young people with education, health and care plans if we look at the rest of the country. I do think we have been looking at this, and interesting, I was actually at a session on Monday where we were talking about decision making in the law. At the moment, the context that we're in is the legislation changed in 2014, so obviously a lot of what we're seeing going through tribunals is actually testing new law. So is it testing new law? Is our interpretation of the new law what's actually the thing that we need to look at better? Or are we just fundamentally getting things wrong? And those are some of the things that we need to look at. I think some of the issues around, for example, what we've seen going through tribunals more and more is the actual process of the education, health and care plan is being tested through the law. So we're seeing quite a few cases going through tribunals there. And that's clearly shown us where we need to be doing things better. And it's important that we learn from the case law that's coming out of first tier tribunal and upper tier tribunal. Could I put my finger on an absolute, I think it's that? In all honesty, no, I couldn't do that. I don't know what Helen's feeling is from a Bromley perspective.
Well, I think maybe from a London-wide perspective, as far as the was saying that the first part of the meeting and our briefing papers, that there are more specialist places being sought in the London region than anywhere else. So sometimes the tribunals, local mediation cases held locally that went to appeal, it's 35% in 35% that were followed by appeals to the tribunal. So there's a tremendous amount that things are resolved in London before they go on to tribunal. But if you've got more families, because of the scarcity of places, as in your introduction to this debate this morning, and you've got more families chasing fewer places and feeling that there's not sufficient local places, then families are going to go to local mediation and then on to tribunal. And I think the issue of places is very clearly evidence that there's more scarcity of some places in the London boroughs.
I do want to raise something that I think is an area that's becoming more challenging. An example that was given at this law session that I was at on Monday was a local authority had approached 19 mainstream school settings to be named in an education, health and care plan. Now, whilst the local authority, under the law, can simply name one of those schools, all 19 schools did not want that child with SEN. And we do need to consider how...
They didn't want children.
They did not want that child with SEN. Please, and I'm not... This is not me having a dig at schools. I think this does come back to the fact that we've got schools that can be very nervous about can we genuinely meet that child's needs. Our teachers feel sufficiently well equipped to support that child. And this does then genuinely bring a bearing on things like how we approach commissioning, because if our mainstream school settings are feeling that nervous about welcoming a child with SEN, we then have to think about what our targeted services do, potentially then what our specialist services do. So I genuinely do come back to the fact, and Gill made the point very eloquently right at the beginning, that we have teachers that don't feel sufficiently equipped to support children with SEN.
Well, it goes back to the point also Gill makes about having the joint training of primary and SEND rather than separate. Because if you're not trained for something, surely you're going to be...
There's a very big context in time at the moment as well. Every single statement has to be converted to an education, health and care plan by next April the 1st. So at the moment, one of the real big underlining factors around the increase in tribunals is that many more families are having the right to appeal a final plan because they're being transferred from a statement to a plan, and at that point of the EHC plan being finalised, I imagine that we're going to see a significant dip, because once all the plans have been transferred from a statement to a plan, you wouldn't be having so many people at one time. You've got the new EHC needs assessments going on and the transfers going on, where the final plan is the point when parents are saying, do I agree with this plan, or am I going to appeal?
Can I ask a question on that? You talk about it being a spike, but surely the trend has been continuing upwards, irrespective of the switch to EHCPs. Would that be fair? The trend, i.e. for places, people becoming more savvy, which we think in London because of course Londoners are more savvy than anywhere else. But in effect, this is a spike in a trend after the EHCP appeals and so on have gone through simply because of the change. It's not going to decline, is it? The trend is not going to reverse.
I think there will be a dip next year once the plans are transferred, but the trend and it's going to be very interesting because the single route of redress is going to include health and care as the pilot from next March for a couple of years. So it's going to be very interesting to see the people that are going to be going for to the part of the national trial around education, health and care. And I do believe that there will be again a number of people going, not just for a number of children going, not just for the education components, but for the education, health and care components, because they're seeing that as a route through to getting the provision for their child.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think that's something that we'll return to next year. Susan, the last part of your question.
Thank you. Considering 88% of the cases that reach tribunal are found in favour of the child or the young person or family, is it cost effective, therefore, for the authorities to defend decisions of a tribunal, at a tribunal?
I think it would be not a good thing to always walk away from tribunals, because we are genuinely in that testing space of the law. And if we've got it wrong, we have to hold our hands up and say we've got it wrong and we need to do it better. I think that part of the reason that this happens is, and I think particularly at the moment, picking up Helen's comment around that we're about to go towards a national trial to make sure that recommendations can be made for health and care, is quite often what can happen in a tribunal is the tribunals predominantly look at education, but if we've had a challenge, and I'm not pointing a finger of blame, if we've had a challenge making sure that our other partners are doing what they need to do, the law defaults back to the local authority, has to ensure that the provision is there. And that can quite often be the reason that local authorities lose cases. We do need to consider also the fact that we're again, thinking about the new legislation, we're in an environment where we have set up extremely high expectations for families and parents. And have we got that bit right too? So it's not wrong for us to continue to pursue tribunals when we genuinely think we've got it right. I think for me, we need to be really, really clear about why we are deciding to take something forward through a tribunal. And that's where truly the case law is helpful, because it does help present out to local authority or our NHS colleagues or our care colleagues, actually, yeah, you didn't really interpret the law correctly there, but over and above that, you didn't serve that family well. And that's the learning you have to take from it.
And is learning taken? I mean, we all hear from so many different committees. There's learning, and
yes,
and Helen was saying all these parent forums and everything. But I mean, lots of us sit in meetings all the time. Does it get translated into things happening?
Yes, it does. So I mean, I mentioned the session that I was at on Monday, for example. That was a really helpful session because we had education, care and health colleagues there looking at case law and looking at our interpretation of the law from each side, and actually saying, oh, now actually we can see why we've let that family down, or we can see where we've failed to communicate effectively to a family early enough on.
So from that, does a recommendation come out that's given out to other people? Is there any fields that you can go for learning? Because it's great for all of you sitting in that room, with respect, but that's not going to... How does that get disseminated to other people? Because that's the thing. It's no good in this room today if we think, oh my goodness, that's the answer to that, if we don't then go and do something with it. Because at the end of the day, these tribunals may cost the boroughs a fortune. They also cost that family a lot of grief and hardship. These are families that are in the worst possible position, and it is our duty to look after them more than a lot of other people, I would suggest. Therefore, what are we doing with the information and all these wonderful things that we're hearing? How is that always take your meeting from Monday. What are you going to do with that so that that knowledge goes elsewhere?
Right, well, I know what I'll be doing, because I'll be working with Helen and the rest of the regional group to make sure that we're disseminating those findings. Every single practitioner in that room from health, which should also have a responsibility to make sure that they're actually discussing it with their health professionals. That's where I can have conversations with Elaine Ruddy to say, right, do we need to be doing more joint sessions? And Alison's nodding, so I'm talking about NHS, so I don't know if Alison wants to contribute to that.
I was a general manager in South West London before I did this role, and managed therapies and things. So we would always routinely look in depth at local tribunals we've been involved with and share that learning, but also track case law that was relevant. And I've always done that as a matter of good practice, so I share that with my colleagues at the moment. I chair a clinical reference group for SEND that has representatives from all the services in our 5 main provider organisations that work with us. And one of our key messages is always what's the learning from recent tribunals in terms of case law, and certainly my local authority colleagues do that cascade of learning within the SEN service as well. We've watched with interest the pilot to date around involving health and care. Actually, disappointingly, there haven't been that many cases that have gone to tribunal around the health and care, hence the rollouts. And those that have, actually the majority of decisions weren't upheld in from a health point of view in relation to family, but a lot were sorted out as part of the case management process. So I think that's again the learning of the new sort of processes. But I think there's always more we can do in terms of sharing the learning from tribunals.
So there's no forum that you can put this onto that people in Scotland could read, or do you know what I mean? Or
what I feel, I cannot emphasise enough the importance of local mediation before you go to tribunal, and to really emphasise that that if you can get that local mediation right, it can be so stressful for families needing to go to tribunal. And if we put a lot of energy into getting that local mediation right at the point of frontline services with the local people, and that's part of the new Children and Families Act. There wasn't local mediation before tribunal. If we can get that right, and really look at how you resolve cases before you have to go down that very quite hard road for everyone, but particularly for the families around going to a tribunal. So I really feel that is something we can do across London together, in really looking at that local mediation, which is a new part of the reforms.
Yes, or if we could get the provision right in the first place,
of course,
these poor families wouldn't go through it. Thank you very much.
Because coming back to you talked about 33% being resolved at local mediation. So was that for Bromley? So 77?
In London, mediation cases held, which were followed by appeals to tribunal during 2016, was 35%. So a number of quite a large percentage of 65%. Mediation cases were resolved locally and not needing to go on to the tribunal.
Yes, but that's what you would expect. So my question is, and following on what you've just said, if that is the best place, and I think it comes back to what Susan said, it's about how practice is disseminated. So in terms of picking out from the experience what has gone wrong, who is doing that monitoring? Is there anybody doing that monitoring? So then feeding that back into the system so people can learn from that.
Well, that will happen at local level. I mean, obviously, we're talking about mediation and tribunal at a local level. Then mediation and tribunal invariably ends up in front of senior officers like Helen or a Director of Children's Services. So that clearly points to a weakness in provision. We would want to look at that weakness being addressed. So, for example, I know that one of the most significant areas, and I'm sure you've definitely heard this, is we have truly struggled to get provision right for 19 to 25-year-olds for a very long time, and that's still not right, and we need to do better. So there's a lot of work going on around making sure that we've got particularly young people's provision better. So looking at, for example, a piece of work that's currently going on in Croydon, for example, where they know that they want to get far better provision for 19 to 25-year-olds, where they want to get the local college to work more closely with schools. That work's starting to happen now. Bromley's actually already got a good example of where they got the Further Education College to work directly with all the special schools in the area to make sure that the 19 to 25 provision was better. It didn't just become better, it was literally transformed. It can be better still. But those again are examples of where we need to get that right. You, Chair, you talked about a cliff edge earlier. We also need to be very careful that in making sure that we get our 19 to 25-year-old provision better within the statutory framework, that we don't create a cliff edge then at 25. Yeah. And this is where, of course, we have to think about how we're delivering provision. And actually, Alison talked about it really well in terms of helping healthcare professionals think about not just delivering hours or widgets or a service, it's the outcome for the young person. Then, does the young person have the opportunity to live more independently? Do they have the opportunity to enjoy paid work? Are they welcomed by their community? And we have to build all of those things into, when we think about commissioning services, it's the outcome at the other end. It's not just, oh, we can do this until you're 25. And I think that that's the bit we need to really properly build into our commissioning right across education, health and care. And this is, of course, when we're getting into very deep cultural change. Are we sufficiently preparing employers to say, do you have inclusive practices? Do you have working interviews? Do you make sure that you look at all the talent that's around you for young people? When we're considering housing planning, are we thinking about adaptive and flexible housing, those sorts of things?
And it's reasonable, isn't it, sometimes for an employer to turn to the statutory services and say, you're not in any position to tell us what to do because you've got to do so much more work yourself. So it is about how we work strategically together on this piece. Let me just take us on to...
No, I'd like to ask a couple of questions, please, again related to tribunals.
Yes.
Is there a pattern in relation to tribunals, i.e. what is the principal cause of a case going to tribunal? Is it, for example, parents appealing because they can't get a place at a school in a particular borough? Or is it that they can't get a place at a school in their own borough? I mean, what is the principal cause for people going to tribunal, for there being a dispute?
Primary reason at the moment is refusal to assess. Is part of the statutory process is local authorities are asked to make a decision about whether they go to assessment. This is well before issuing an education, health and care plan, and recently that's been the principal reason to go to tribunal. And of course that is a very new space in law because that's all to do with the 2014 Act.
Yes, I see. But the kind of thing that I've mentioned, parents wanted to get their child to access a particular school, a particular authority. I am right, aren't I, that a child who has been assessed, who has a plan, can go to any school they wish and in effect trump the locals.
It's there is a group or type of organisations in schools which can be named in an education, health and care plan under statutory rule. There are another group of institutions, including non-maintained schools, for example, which they don't fall under that statute, so they don't have to be named in an education, health and care plan. But yes, being able to express a preference is absolutely part of the legislation.
Relating to that, I'll come to that in a second. I've had a case reported to me of a school which is outstanding, and the demand for SEN education at that school has been such that the school fears that it's going to actually tip the balance and will prevent that school from being outstanding because it's going to have to divert so many resources, irrespective of the fact that there's going to be funding following the children, that the school, therefore, is very reluctant to take these children.
Well, I mentioned the instance where a local authority had 19 schools, so they didn't want a child with SEN. I mean, you've actually painted an interesting picture here where I don't want to stray into national policy, but schools are under a great deal of pressure to perform. Children with SEN perform in a different way. They might not classically get a qualification, but they can still progress. They can still demonstrate their talents. They just don't get qualification. But if a school is measured by the qualifications its children get, then they are going to be reluctant. I think we've also highlighted an issue here where we've got schools that do put a lot of effort and energy, training with their teachers, etc., to support children with SEN. By definition, they become popular with parents. And frankly, that starts to take the pressure off on those schools that aren't doing as well as they could.
I'm not sure whether or not you're sympathising with the dilemma of the school that I've cited. In effect, their belief, they're willing to accept these children. Their belief is that because they're accepting those children, I appreciate that there are all kinds of perhaps, ethical ways in which you can assess the success of a school. But under the current rules, school is outstanding. But because it's going to have to divert resources and things of this sort to children with a plan, they will cease to be outstanding.
Personally, I'm hoping that the work with the Rochford Review will raise this profile because there are so many recommendations in that about supporting mainstream schools to teach pupils with SEND, and one of the main focuses is training the teachers. And I'm hoping that the recognition of data and qualifications is taken into consideration, because most of the children with SEND make far more progress than children in mainstream schools, but unfortunately at the moment that progress cannot be measured because the DFE in general do not have the data capacity presented to them by the schools. At the moment, special schools and mainstream schools have so many ways of assessing data, and just for an example, I'm on the Teaching School Council. When a school applies to become a teaching school, the data is sent to me. It's not analysed by the DFE. The actual progress data is sent to me. And I think the Rochford Review will hopefully stop that from happening in the future, that there is a recognised data analysis which takes place at the DFE to recognise the progress of those children.
I mean, that's such an important point that we've reached here in terms of the Department of Education's lack of engagement with data. Is that what you're saying? So
I don't think it's a lack. I think it's because the schools have changed so much in regard to the pupils that they now teach.
Right.
There are so many commercial packages of data on the market because special schools are not presented with a set type of data as mainstream schools don't have. So schools have gone off finding their own way of measuring performance, and I think the Rochford Review has realised, particularly with the P scales, that they are no longer sufficient in measuring the progress of the majority of the children in our special schools, especially the children who are working in non-specific subjects, and that's P1 to 3, where developmentally they're probably around 18 months old. Okay. So it's looking at all aspects of measuring data that's effective and necessary, rather than labelling a child as a P3 or a P4.
Well, what we can do is look at the evidence we've gathered and match that up with the comments.
I can keep you in touch
with that.
Chair, with that.
Yes. Let's talk.
And it's a very, very good, it's an outstanding relationship with the DFE and schools. It really is.
So, just for clarity, academy schools, Yolande, academy schools are not within that list that's given to
Academies can be named.
They can be named.
Education, health
and
care.
They can be, are they?
Yes, they are.
Right.
The issue there is, of course, how much leverage a local authority has with that academy.
Right, which depends on relationships locally.
It's a combination of relationships, not just locally, because we have seen some interesting issues with certain multi-academy trusts.
Right.
I think one of the things we probably do need to be better at when it comes to leveraging academies, ensuring that we're using the routes available to us, for example, not just Ofsted, but also the Department for Education. Obviously, the Secretary of State has final say with academies. We probably need to be a little bit better there, where we're finding we need to do more work with our academies.
Faith schools, would they be?
Faith schools can be named as well.
Is there any school which can't be named then?
There are independent non-maintained schools,
Yes.
and there are other private organisations which still deliver, which, whilst they can be named, they don't fall under that statutory grouping. I'm very happy to send you a list which clearly identifies those things.
Because there's this extraordinary case, is there not, in Newham, where money was taken from the SEN budget and handed over to the academies, as I understand it, on the basis that the academies will in fact use, I think the sum of money, £7 million was taken.
30 million.
30 million. Was taken from the SEN budget, given to academies on the understanding that they would use that budget for SEN purposes. Is that something you're familiar with?
It's not, and I'd like to go and have a look at it.
I've just been sent a news cutting about it.
Oh.
You are right, 7. I've got 30.
Okay. No, we're not. Just a minute, Tony. We're not going to take evidence from the Sun into this hearing.
It's called.
Or even the Daily Mail.
No, it's called the Newham something or the other.
No, let's put that to the side, and we'll come back to whatever
But it's
the
not
Newham.
something you're familiar with.
Yeah.
That's the point.
But can I say, Chair, I think your question was really getting to the fact that if a school is named on a statement, if they're a maintained school, they can be compelled to take the pupil.
Yes. But
Academy, you can't.
You can't compel the academy. No, so let's make a note of that. And
The local authority can't compel them. The Secretary of State can.
The Secretary of State can. And I wonder if the glorious commissioners can. Schools commissioners can. I suppose they can have conversations with people, can't they?
Well, we are talking to the regional school commissioners about how we can utilise them and deploy them in a better way. Because at the end of the day, we also don't want to end up in a situation where we're having a fight with the school, because we want to know what it is that the school needs to ensure they can meet the needs of that child.
Fix it, yeah.
Going back, and I take the point that Tony raised, because we heard this informally about that trigger. You know, a school is fine and has the capacity to deal with 3 or 4 children, and then of course it's an excellent school, and of course as a parent you would want your child in there, wouldn't you, especially it's in your area. And I was talking to a head, and it goes back to this point where they're going to have to wait for a tribunal decision in a way to either force them, and I don't know how forcing them is going to help them, because they don't have the capacity. And isn't that really what you were talking about in terms of the tribunal? So much policy is being made because of tribunal results.
This is not necessarily coming down to tribunal results. I think that there is genuinely a wider issue here. We do see parents who and families who want to take something through tribunal for a particular institution to take their child. But quite often what we see is during that process, the parents stop the process, not because they don't want to go to tribunal, is why would they want their child to go to a school where they're not welcome?
Yes, exactly. So.
And that's often why those cases don't go forward. And whilst I think, and we can work with our colleagues in boroughs to help them be better at looking at the support side for schools, at the end of the day, quite often the local borough ends up between the rock and a hard place, because it's the borough that is defending a situation that it itself finds indefensible in a tribunal situation.
It gets worse. Okay, David.
It's complicated. I wouldn't say it gets worse, but it's definitely complicated.
Well, I think it's a bit more than that from a parent's point of view. It's gross.
And of course, often parents would want their child to be in a school that welcomes them, and so the schools that really welcome them were saying, we do welcome them, we do value them, we do promote inclusion, we do all the things that we would want our children with special educational needs and disabilities. But there's many heads, and I'm at the front line of some of those things, that will say, well, yes, but we just can't take too many. They need to be. Everyone needs to be shared out, and everyone needs to have that welcoming approach, and that's part of the cultural change, isn't it?
Okay. David, you've got a question to Alison about CCG.
Yeah, it's about the health aspect of this, and I know you've covered some of these things before, but just like to sort of get every last bit of information we can. Is what do you see as the main roles of the CCGs, the clinical commissioning groups, and the wider NHS in supporting children with SEND?
I think we need to ensure that we are commissioning the right services, and a lot of that comes down to data. We've heard those comments in relation to schools planning, but I think understanding that our population through joint strategic needs assessments with the local authority, that gap between what are the services that we need and the services that we have now, what are the services that our parents and young people are telling us that they want, and sometimes it's not a service. You know, we live in service land. That's not the experience that parents want to have. I think the Simon Stevens 5-year forward, that promotion of personal budgets, personal health budgets, is a real role for CCGs. There isn't much market out there at the moment. You know, you can really only buy the traditional services that you've always been able to buy. So how the CCG work with others to stimulate the market for alternative provision. I think definitely working with local partners to make sure that we do this together, that we are all around the table, that join up of the 0 to 18 with the services around young people in adulthood. That's often quite fragmented at the moment, with one set of commissioners commissioning the 0 to 19 and another set of commissioners commissioning beyond that. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the sustainability and transformation plans. Only one of the London STPs has a direct reference to SEND in it. They all mention children, but in particular in relation to children with SEN disabilities. So I think it's ensuring that whilst it's a relatively small part of the population, they are young people, children, young people who will go on to often have additional needs into adulthood, making sure that they are visible as part of a priority of a CCG, and it's not just the winter pressures, the how do we move services from acute to community, but this particular vulnerable group of our population are seen as a priority. So we're asked as part of the NHS England and Council of Disabled Children audit tool of is there somebody at board level in CCG who is championing children with SEN disabilities, and I think it is about that prominence and visibility and a commitment to this group.
How good are the CCGs at doing all of that at the moment?
I think it's very variable. In all honesty, CCGs across London, like local authorities, have got huge financial pressures, and so I think it's where does it fit in those priorities. North West London that I sit in has got SEND in its STP. Have we done enough to move that forward? I think there could be a much greater pace from a CCG point of view. I think the alignment with the Transforming Care agenda also should be, along with SEND, needs to be something, and again we're looking at that with our NHS England colleagues to make sure that they're not seen as two sort of separate projects, because they are a very similar cohort of children and young people. But I think doing it together with the local authority has to be key, because otherwise we'll end up duplicating or overlapping sort of resources. So it is that joint planning.
If a child has an ECHR, how does the care differ from a CCG if it comes from an education perspective or from a health perspective? Is there a difference in the sort of pathway to receiving special care?
No, so we have The child's health needs get described in section C of an education, health and care plan, and if we have needs there, there's an expectation that we have provision that will meet those needs in section G of the plan. So a lot of that will fall within what is readily commissioned services. So that might be follow-up. If you're a young child who has Down syndrome, then part of that care would be your follow-up in terms of, any heart problems, visual problems, developmental difficulties. Your physiotherapy would normally have been available routinely or whatever. I think we get this, so occasionally we will have bespoke packages where what we commission as part of the local offer it isn't sufficient to meet that young person's needs. So we would discuss that at our SEN resource panel, which I sit on. I would then take that back to the CCG and say, we've got evidence that this young person needs something more, and that will then go through agreement with the CCG. Or we have mechanisms where we're looking at joint funding placements for young people with complex needs. So I think most areas have some sort of panel where the CCG and local authority would make those agreements between them. But the majority of healthcare that's written into an education, health and care plan is usually part of what is routinely commissioned. The challenging area is always therapies, because we know that on the whole, particularly speech and language therapy and occupational therapy will be seen as meeting an educational need, not a health need, and case law very clearly tells us that. So we have the challenge that those services are often either entirely commissioned by health or jointly commissioned between health and the local authority, and sometimes it's around how those services, the distribution of those services are made. So we have an example locally where the majority of our speech and language therapy provision is tied up in delivering speech and language therapy that's in education, health and care plans, which means there's increasingly less that's available at the universal and targeted level. So you then have this vicious circle because the message gets out that you can't get speech and language therapy unless you've got an education, health and care plan. Whereas actually if we had that, the Burko report was very clear, speech and language is everyone's business. How much of that is part of what we do as a health visitor in children's centres, as part of quality first teaching. So we've got communication champions in schools, so that actually only the children who really need the direct intervention from a speech and language therapist have that, and have that written into a plan if that's what's needed. And that graduated approach, but I think that's around often changing parental expectations, where it's seen as the only way of improving a child's speech and language is that 20 minutes in the broom cupboard sort of once a week on a face-to-face basis. And we know from all the evidence shows some children need that, but the majority don't. So I think that whole what's health and what's education can be a challenge. And that's where joint commissioning, pooled budgets, and a joint agreement on where those priorities are really important between health and education.
Okay, thank you.
Any more tea? Coffee? Okay. Tony?
Yes. You've already heard from the chairman, this is for you, Jo, about the influence that City Hall has on bringing people together. One of the things we're always hearing about the health service and social services is that they're not properly joined up, things like discharge. What question I want to ask is how we collaborate between education. We have had some talk about it because we've been talking about the CCGs and the healthcare system to ensure that such collaboration follows the child right through to the age of 25, so that we don't get progressive cliff edges. And I'm wondering, Jo, how you think that the Mayor can support these children as they progress, and where maybe their needs are seen primarily as health rather than education. Is there anything we can do?
Well, I've already talked a little bit about our data information about places planning. We, and you're aware, we produce an annual education report each year which looks at education in London, and that has consistently cited that certain groups, including children with SEND, underachieve. And so as a result of that, what we're doing is we've started to commission some London level research looking at underachievement in certain groups, including children with SEND, about what works. And so we'll be releasing that at some point in the spring, that should be. So we can do the data and the research. The Mayor then obviously liaises regularly, and our officers do, with London councils in particular to look at that sort of system-wide help that we can give. But we've got some programmes as well here at City Hall that do specifically target children and young people with SEND. So perhaps if I could just run through some of the key ones, and then obviously if there's any further detail you want, I can either try to give you that now or in writing at a later stage. Well, the Mayor obviously has a role in making the case for London to London Government, and he recently went with the Chair of London Council's Cllr to see the Justice Secretary, the Education Secretary even, Justice Greening, and put the case for funding for London schools, including the SEND provision.
Good.
So that's a role he has of being the voice for London. He will continue to play that part. But particular schemes that we do, we've doing some work for the first time on early years provision from City Hall, and we've put out our prospectus for 3 early years hubs in London, and we've got those bids back, which we're evaluating now. And as part of that prospectus, we said that we required them to actually particularly target children with SEND and their families. And one of our metrics on that is to try and increase the take-up of a 2-year-old free entitlement in an area. And part of the ability to get that 2-year-old entitlement, one of the criteria is if children have SEND. So hopefully that will assist. And
could we see that prospectus, Jo?
Yes,
yeah,
I can send you some information on that. And we should be announcing the successful bids, hopefully this time, this side of Christmas. We're also exploring through our other early years programmes what we can do to improve childcare places in general. You'll be aware that we also launched a Schools for Success programme in September, and this is trying to build on the work that the London Challenge did about identifying good practice and trying to share that with others. And if you go onto the website, and I'm just thinking as I'm reading through these, what might be useful is if we have perhaps an informal session with the committee, just to take you through some of the work we've been developing and doing, if that would be helpful to you. But this is 100 schools sharing best practice who have, and this is from Ofsted data, who have made good or excellent progress in progressing children from underachieving groups. And there's a group of schools that do very good work in SEND that are highlighted as some of our Schools for Success. And the idea is that other schools that want to improve their practice can look on our map, they can click on a school, they can book an appointment to go and visit that school, and then there will be London-wide sharing of best practice at sessions that will be held across the city. It's been mentioned about one of the best things for all children, especially children with SEND, is quality teaching. And we will be launching shortly our teacher recruitment and retention web pages, trying to encourage people to teach in London and do their initial teacher training here. So it would be very good. I should talk to Gill, I think, a little later about what pressure we can put on about that initial teacher training as well. And you'll be aware of our Getting Ahead programme about quality head teachers and raising their aspirations to apply. we have a range then of projects from other parts of the GLA that work in schools. So, for example, our Mayor's Peer Outreach Team, a group of young people, have led for us work at New City College, formerly Redbridge College, working with SEND and excluded students. They've done a 9-month programme with those students, and it's been rated exemplary and excellent by Ofsted. And they are now proposing to roll that out to 2 new colleges in Hackney and Tower Hamlets this next year. And the London Team Ambassadors programme supports young people through social actions, through volunteering. And since 2015, the programme has engaged 57 SEND schools and is looking to work with a lot more in the future. And you'll be interested in the careers offer we're making, particularly as the expansion of the duties to the age 25. But London Ambitions, you'll have heard of these before, as our 12 careers clusters across London who are looking to improve practice and careers guidance. And all of those will work with schools that deal with children with SEND. But there's a specific cluster, the Ealing Specialist Careers Cluster, is led by Redwood Education and Skills, and that focuses specifically on improving outcomes for young people and SEND. And the idea of these clusters is, they're pilot for a couple of years, and then that practice should be shared across the whole city. But we can certainly send you further information on any of those, and perhaps if members are willing, want to, perhaps go and visit some of these programmes as well.
Yeah, that's lovely. And then going back to what you've just said, what would be lovely is if you could say, of the ambassadors and of the London outreach team, how many of those young people with SEND needs?
Can I get back to you with that, happily?
Because we've already talked about employers getting involved, and I mean, we're awful, aren't we? No matter how good you are, we're saying, but... Do you know what I mean?
Well, I know our peer outreach team, our linked up crew, were very representative of London.
But
and Tony's looking.
But it would be nice if you could come back or raise that.
Yes.
Because you can't be asking people to do unless you're doing it yourself. Tony?
I think we covered it, have we not?
We have covered it through the early years hubs, and Susan, can you follow on?
We've covered a lot of this, but if there's any to add,
Senkos.
it's mainly to you, Jo. Providing the necessary training and professional development for Senkos is expensive for schools. Would the Mayor support the provision of SEND in London through any of his existing interventions, for example, developing school leaders and promoting best practice?
Yeah, and some of the programmes I've just launched, I've just talked about do that, particularly Skills for Success, where good practice we have identified in a number of schools, and then we're made it available to the sector to so teachers can, as I said, click on a school and book a visit through our website to visit a school that shares, that has good practice. And we're envisaging that this will lead to London-wide SEND professional development opportunities as well, which I think is going to be key.
That won't cover Senkos necessarily.
No. But it will do, because the best practice in those schools will cover all teaching staff, but other staff as well.
Gill, have you got anything to add?
I think the 140 million that the Secretary of State gave out for the Strategic School Improvement Fund, in some local authorities they are using it to train Senkos in mainstream schools. Bids being put in for in excess of about 500,000, and we're now at round 3. So I think for the forward-thinking authorities, they are going to use that funding, which is a significant amount of money, and I'm hoping that it can be used effectively, and other local authorities will adopt that model. One of the concerns at the moment is how quickly that funding is being spent, and I think the Secretary of State may, if it's not spent when she needs it to be spent, will be clawing it back. I think it's the schools who know what it is they need to do, who are being proactive with this, but we've still got a silo of schools who, for whatever reason, do not get current information, and they're usually the schools that are not attached to teaching schools. Mm-hmm. So there's a big piece of work, really, with local authorities to try and identify those schools. Plus the fact that special schools, because of what I said about the data earlier, are not identified as coasting schools, and they too are the schools that need support, but they don't come out on any statistics other than when they have the next Ofsted, and they might drop into a category. So along with the DFE, I think they are key people at the DFE, and you know, I'm hoping that Helen will be part of that with me, as from this meeting. We'll be perhaps putting a more joint together piece of work to try and engage all schools, not just the good and the great.
Thank you.
Yolande, can pressure be put, I mean, it's a substantial amount of money, you know, in the right places. Can pressure not be put upon boroughs that are not, you know, show them up really, if they're not actually putting the money in the right place and spending it? I mean, for it to be clawed back because it's not being used, it lets everybody down really.
Yeah, and that's certainly something I can go back and look at and work with Helen through our regional team to look at how that money is being deployed. Of course, the other bit that I would be interested in looking at is, if it's local authority, we're deploying it probably with our mainstream schools, but are we making sure that academies have access to that as well?
Yes, it tends to be academies, multi-academy trusts, local authorities and teaching schools that are putting the bids together. Now, there are so many local authority schools that are not attached to any of those. And are they missing that substantial amount of money?
The link could be London councils, because I mean it would be absolutely criminal if this isn't used up in the correct way. It is properly ring-fenced when it's through.
There are certain criteria, yes, but it's based on the needs of that local authority.
Yeah.
So it's connected to what the schools need. It's not a government initiative. It's identifying the needs of the pupils in those particular schools and then putting a subsequent bid in.
Well, it's ideal for London councils to really run with this and make sure that the funding goes to the right.
I'll explore something with Gill.
And some of the things we've been lobbying in, I mean, we're looking at education being a preparation for life that included all children. Our regional London Parent Carer Forum representatives, she emailed me last night and said that Robert Goodwill at the National Parent Carer Forum conference in Manchester yesterday sort of really announced that you know, his drive around every child with SEND should have the right support at the right time and to develop their potential. And then it was announced that as a result of lobbying, that there's going to be another 9.7 million for supported internships, because to really think about some of our children with SEN and disability going immediately into work without having that supported internship. So that was very much welcomed as a result of lobbying and in developing those life pathways.
Well, this leads beautifully into my next question. Thank you. So what are the pathways for those children who reach the school leaving age? What is the Mayor going to do to ensure young people with SEN can access suitable training for life and employment? So, Jo.
Well, you have to realise there's a whole range of needs, and some children may need very different and more supported care than others. You'll have seen that the London Skills Strategy was announced a few days ago, and to get a better picture of that post-16 SEND in particular, a Pan-London SEND review is taking place, and this will work with London's special and educational needs and disability experts to present an up-to-date picture and demand for SEND 16 plus education provision in London for the next 5 years. This will fit in then to that preparatory work, because we're expecting the adult skills budget to come down to the Mayor in 2019. So that will be if you like, a piece of work to plot the provision at the moment by the benchmark. And then the idea is that will then be an annual review, so that we can hopefully change provision very quickly, because we've seen over the last few years, you know, the increase, for example, of children on the autistic spectrum that have been coming forward, and if we have that up-to-date data, that will really help. I think with FE as well, and the skills strategy does have a passage in it on the need to have an inclusive, particularly FE offer and skills offer for all children. You know, last week I was at College of North East London, and they've co-located an autism college on site, Ambitious for Autism, which looks at, you know, those children that have the most complex needs. But actually that's working very well. And for those young people that need very intensive support, they have a separate area in the college which is quiet, but actually they have support from the FE college right next door too. But the level of provision and difference is and what's needed is very different. But what they're finding actually is that working together and the links that those FE colleges have, particularly with businesses, means that actually they can and they are working to change businesses' attitudes towards children who may need some extra care. Now, the college that I was at, you know, Ambitious for Autism, was working with some really big players, you know, major banks or whatever, who perhaps have the capacity to do that. But they gave me, there is, you know, a few success stories of children and young people that perhaps a few years ago would not have been expected to enter the world of work, but are now holding down, not full-time, but part-time jobs and having independent living. But the offer has to be different. It has to be that sort of academic, that work experience, but also how to live independently, how to navigate the buses, how to budget. So it's a different, and the review should hopefully say what's out there, but then we really are going to have to look when that budget comes down as to exactly what the provision is.
Also, business should realise that they need to harness some of the incredible numeracy skills of some people on the spectrum that are incredible. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and just to follow on from that, Joanne, I think certainly we welcome that in the skills strategy published last Friday, the Mayor outlined plans to carry out that pan-London review of SEND education provision. I wonder if you're able to say who will be leading on that? Will that be yourself or another?
Yolande sat on the awarding body. Is it?
We've gone out to tender for an organisation to work with us to do that data work. The organisation, the winning organisation, I think we're outside of the 10 days, so I probably can say it's Mime Consulting. They're also working with the special educational needs specialists, because this isn't just about the data, it's about the right data and how we can ensure that we're looking at the right data sources to plan. I think the important thing with this piece of work is also not for them to do such an incredibly detailed piece of work that would never be replicated, is actually to say, help us figure out which are the best data sources for us to use. Then on an annual basis, we continually relook at planning. So it's helping us develop not just a tool to look for the next 5 years, it's helping develop a tool that we can use consistently to continue to update our planning. And it's actually, data is often considered quite dry. This is, I think, genuinely quite an exciting piece of work and will help us to really start to see the demand coming through the system, then properly help inform our ability to commission, work with schools and colleges to think about what provision really needs to be in place.
No, that's excellent, to be welcome. And so you've got the organisation doing the work, and then you would, be giving them a 9-month period and then publishing their report this time next year?
Yeah, well, hopefully a little bit earlier. So we're going to press them to do this fairly quickly, but obviously not so quickly as it's not right. But we'd certainly be looking for some quite rich interim findings towards the end of this financial year.
And then back to you, Joanne. In terms of preparing for 2019, we know, I sit on economy with some of my colleagues, our economy committee will be looking at that whole skills framework that will be transferred to the GLA in 2019. But you, with your educational lead, how will you be intersecting with that work?
Our officer teams work very closely with Gill's Pipes team, and what we need to make sure that we just have a seamless progression. And I think one of the, not only in provision but actually in careers and options, so that young people are making the right pathway choices for them. So we do have a close discussions, and officers meet on a regular basis.
And that brings us nicely at 12 o'clock we've covered all the questions we set out. We've got other follow-ups, certainly from what you've told us, and I do hope that we'll be able to get back to you to clarify some of the points. Gill, certainly we need to speak more with you to understand from your point of view, in terms of those high-level requests. I mean, I personally put a request to the Mayor to say when he was meeting with the Secretary of State that he was to come back and report that he had got SEND on his agenda. So I'm glad that Joanne can report that that was the case.
Yeah, I believe it was. I think on that discussion, Claire Cope put in on the discussion.
It was. Yeah. It was genuinely really helpful to have the Mayor with Councillor Cope, because we were highlighting significant pressures in London. We had a shortfall of £100 million on the high needs budget for the last financial year, and I know our health colleagues are under similar financial constraints as well.
And Joanne, thank you for talking about the map that's there, that's accessible to all parents and now has SEND information on it, because that was one of the first recommendations. Tony, you remember from our first piece of work about the portal, which is now moved to the map.
This is primarily for the teaching profession, for them to identify where there's good practice.
But I think
and to share.
It's an extension on the one that is there for parents. And I went on the other day, and whereas it was just mainstream schools that were highlighted, you can now go on and find a SEND school. So in the same way that another parent can do it. So we welcome that, and I just wanted to flag that up that, to anybody listening. This isn't, going back to the point that Susan made, we're not just here as a talking shop. We do come through with some recommendations and follow them up, and we have seen in the past how those recommendations have changed practice and are brought to fruition.
Sorry, I think also the fact that in my role as Vice Chair of the Teaching School Council, I've got 2 days per week. One is as the Vice Chair role, and one is SEND representative across the country, which is a significant move. So I do think people are taking notice of areas of SEND that do need progressing.
That's great. And through our scrutiny we heard about, and we're still waiting for it, aren't we, the report on ranging on issues on the autistic spectrum. It was published today. I haven't seen it. The all-party group. Yes.
The National Autistic Society.
Working with the National Autistic... We can't hear you, Charlotte. Shout it out.
Society.
Yes, and we've been watching for that because we told it was coming, and it's out today. So that's more reading for us, and there's like everybody's looking forward to that report. So let me just finish by saying what we've just a few things that's popped into our minds as we was going through the meeting. Local authorities, NHS and education. It seems like there's a sense from you experts that it's moving in the right direction, but that there still needs an awful lot of work to do. I mean, the stats that we heard of and the experience of carers and parents demonstrate that maybe we need to look at outcome-focused commissioning. Thank you for that, Alison. And co-production of services. Isn't that a lovely phrase? I mean, I don't know what that would mean to a parent or a carer, but it's something that we can certainly follow up. And we heard about this golden thread. And it's just, it takes us into aspiration territory, because that's really what I'm sure, would all aspire to. Whether that is realised is another matter, and if realised across the piece, rather than in those areas where the parents who are most able can achieve those services, but then you find in other parts of the city that doesn't happen. We heard about the pressures on places, and we also heard about this need for GLA London councils and the NHS to work better, and certainly strategically in terms of the ongoing work of planning places. We had that interesting discussion about tribunals and mediation services, and of course thank you Helen for reminding us, and we have heard it, that the whole thing now is moving towards this point of April 2018, where there will then be the EHC plans available, and then we'll be looking to see what comes out of that at the other end. So we will have that on our agenda in terms of looking to see whether we do get that inclusive service. We talked about data, and there isn't a meeting in this building that doesn't address data, because if you don't know what there is, you know, how can you ask a question about it? So we welcome what we heard about looking to provide that data and for better analysis, and certainly thank you for telling us about the Pan London review that you've just commissioned, and I think you said Mind Consulting. We wish them well with their work, and we'll be following up their report in 9 months' time maybe. I thought there was a good discussion about the role of the mayor. Thank you, Joanne, and the work that you're doing. And in terms of, I think we would still look to the GLA to be providing some London-wide coordination, wouldn't we? In terms of not taking responsibility, because clearly organisations have that responsibility, but enabling, bringing people together, because sometimes for whatever reason it doesn't happen. So just trying to break down those silos on behalf of the children and the families. And we will be, just remind me of the dates we're working to now, Charlotte? We've got loads and loads of work to do, because we've been inundated with stuff, because there's such a lot of interest out there in the work that we're doing.
I would say spring 2018.
Spring. Yeah, and that's for us to carry on. Like we really want to meet up with Gill to hear more, and we will be producing a document, and everybody is wanting to see that document and to hold it. So almost if we can bring together some sort of base about where we are in spring, because we'll know then about the ongoing work that's there. So please, just anything that you want us to know, just drop Charlotte. I love this when I give other people work. Just drop an email to charlotte.harrison@london.gov. We want to hear from you. And really, thank you so much for your involvement and the support that you're giving to this inquiry. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joanne. I've taken a lovely picture of an all-women's panel because it's so rare. So I hope with your permission I can tweet that, because I'm going to go, yippee! 5 top women on the panel. And you are so nice. Oh, excuse me, we're not finished yet, members. Work programme. Get so excited. We had such good stuff today. Can I say to members that I did get a member of the staff to come down and measure the temperature of the room, because we will be putting in an official complaint.
Oh, good. Can you do one for yesterday as
No,
well?
no, that wasn't my committee yesterday.
No, I'm asking the young lady because it is just horrific.
So we have got evidence that the room was just not really warm enough. That's not good enough. So thanks to our guests, we've done that. Can the panel note the report and subsequent discussions today? Noted. And then can the panel please note our work programme for 2017-18? Noting. The panel has recommended to note the work programme, yeah? Yep. Note that we visited Swiss Cottage, told you about a visit to Finland, which Richard Dureski accompanied me and will be produced. Oh, he has produced a report which you saw as Appendix 2. And date of next meeting, we're scheduled to meet Thursday the 8th of February, and then by that time, Charlotte, we'll have some sort of feel about how the work
spring.
Is. Yeah. We'll be heading towards February, spring. I just love hopefulness that you bring to this table.
Absolutely.
But February we'll have some sort of feel of the report. Item 10, there's no other urgent business from me. So thank you, members. And have a great break. But work goes on till the 21st of December. It does indeed. Yeah, I'm going to just bang the gavel to bring it to an end. Thank you.
GLA, Committee Room 5, Sound. GLA, Committee Room